Now beginning. Story 1. The Tale of the Mapmakers Who Forgot North. You are seated at an old oak desk, its surface polished smooth by the years. Dusty light filters in through high windows. Around you, the room is quiet, shelved with atlases that no one has opened in decades. Here, tucked away in forgotten corners of European archives, are the maps made by people who didn't quite know where they were, or worse, who had no idea where north was. Before north became a universally agreed upon direction, it was simply one option, a suggestion. For most of human history, maps were oriented to what mattered most: Jerusalem, paradise, the rising sun, the seat of the king. North was neither sacred nor scientifically stable. It was, for a very long time, just a direction. The pre-North world, maps of meaning, not coordinates. Imagine a time before compasses were widespread, before latitude and longitude stitched the world together. The first maps, Babylonian clay tablets, ancient Egyptian sketches, were about symbolism, not navigation. They reflected power, trade, mythology. They were for temples, kings, and travelers who already knew the way. In medieval Europe, Mappamundi world maps placed east at the top, not north. Orienting. A map literally meant placing the east, from Latin oriens, the rising sun, at the top. These maps often placed Jerusalem in the center, surrounded by continents shaped not by geography but theology. One of the most famous medieval maps, the Hereford Mappamundi c. 1300, stretches over 5 feet wide. It shows the Garden of Eden at the top and monstrous races on the peripheries. North is left, not up, not meaningful, and not forgotten, exactly, just not honored. You begin to understand that the concept of forgetting north wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a cultural one. Why north didn't matter yet. There's a kind of peace in this, the idea that maps weren't obsessed with accuracy. Instead, they reflected a world of rituals, sacred spaces, and cosmic order. Early Chinese maps, by contrast, usually placed the south on top, mirroring the orientation of emperors, who sat facing south. Arab cartographers like Al-Idrisi often put south at the top as well. The world, it seems, had many tops. Travel was local, direction was relational. Go toward the sun. Follow the river until it bends like a sickle. Walk 3 days west and you'll find the trader with the blue tents. The human brain, when left to its own memory, rarely thinks in compass points. It thinks in smells, slopes, stars, and stories. And that was enough. Until the compass arrived. Magnetic interference. The compass meets old habits. The magnetic compass, likely invented in China during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, didn't immediately revolutionize mapping. Even by the time it reached Europe in the 12th century via Arab intermediaries, it was used cautiously. Suspicion lingered. A floating needle pointing to a force no one could see. It felt more like sorcery than science. Pilgrims and traders who trusted the stars suddenly had to trust invisible energy. Even when mariners began using compasses more confidently, cartographers still clung to older ways. One Portuguese portolan chart from the 14th century has over 30 windrose lines radiating from a central compass, rows none of which align with the modern idea of north. Instead, they follow wind systems, trade paths, and coastlines. Practical, yes, but directional, not in the modern sense. In some cases, mapmakers even faked north. They added decorative compass roses pointing upward to appease patrons, but the geography beneath was still skewed by local customs. The rise of standardization and resistance. As trade networks grew more complex, the need for standardized directions became urgent. Maritime empires, Venice, Portugal, Spain, wanted charts that agreed with one another. Sailors needed reliable bearings. Explorers wanted consistency. This gave rise to the demand for north-up maps, but old habits die slowly. Even in the 1500s, many local maps in Europe continued to orient toward church steeples, rivers, or roads. Some tax maps were drawn upside down to fit better on the parchment. In 1525, a minor but fascinating bureaucratic argument broke out in the city of Lubeck. Cartographers submitted a city map that showed the main cathedral at the top south. The town council, newly obsessed with modernizing, demanded it be redrawn with north at the top. The mapmaker refused, citing aesthetics and familiarity. The result? A compromise. The cathedral stayed on top, but a small arrow labeled Septentrio, Latin for north, was added almost apologetically in the corner. It was not an isolated incident. Mapmakers across Europe were quietly battling the rise of modernity with their quills and preferences. The forgotten maps of the mapmakers. There are entire collections, especially in German, Polish, and Italian archives of maps that ignore the compass completely. Local notaries, monastery scribes, and itinerant surveyors drafted land maps that prioritized ownership, drainage, or crop rotation over cardinal accuracy. Some maps placed north sideways, others bent rivers to fit rectangular parchment. One 17th century Italian agricultural map placed the mountains at the bottom because, as the scribe explained, that is where they were in my view. Personal orientation over magnetic truth. The most revealing aspect. These maps worked. People found their way, borders were enforced, taxes were collected. North, forgotten or not, didn't matter until it had to. An odd case, the surveyors who forgot north literally. In the 1730s, a group of mapmakers tasked with charting a new provincial boundary in Bohemia submitted a stunningly detailed map. Roads, farms, even individual tree types were labeled, but there was no indication of direction. When asked to reorient it, they realized something embarrassing. None of them owned a compass. They had relied entirely on local guides and hand-drawn sketches. As a result, north ended up in the bottom right corner. The map was rejected by Vienna's court officials, who called it geographically imaginative but topographically useless. Still, local communities used it for decades, passing copies among villages that didn't care which way north was. They knew where their neighbors lived. That was enough. As you settle deeper into this story of slowly shifting perceptions, you begin to feel the quiet struggle between familiarity and standardization. What does it mean when truth itself, direction, orientation, north becomes a matter of policy? And what happens to those who refuse to turn their maps around? Where north became political. By the mid-18th century, the compass had become a powerful tool not only of navigation, but of governance. As the early modern states of Europe sought to solidify their borders, extract taxes, and assert legal claims over their expanding territories, cartography began its slow transformation from a local craft to a centralized science. And with that shift came something new, north as law. No longer just a vague magnetic whisper, north became the top of every state-commissioned map. It wasn't just about aligning land, it was about aligning power. When a monarch demanded a map of his kingdom, he expected it to look modern, scientific, properly north-oriented. Any map that resisted this style was treated with suspicion, even ridicule. A strange thing began to happen in government offices across Europe. Directionality became evidence. If your land claim was on a map where north was incorrect, it might be dismissed outright. In some regions, even maps made a generation earlier were suddenly invalid, not because the land changed, but because north was no longer where it should be. It was an invisible revolution of rotation. The clerical crisis of 1764, when direction undid a border. Let us now travel to the Rhineland, specifically to a small and rather unimportant town called Wittersheim, where a border dispute erupted not in battle, but in bureaucracy. Wittersheim, nestled along a minor river used for milling wheat, had been left off many larger maps for centuries. Its lands, administered by a local barony, bordered two competing regions, each ruled by different minor nobles who barely tolerated each other. For decades, the arrangement worked because everyone had agreed upon a map drawn in 1699. Then came 1764, and with it, a royal commission from Vienna tasked with correcting local cadastral records' land ownership rolls for taxation purposes. The commission arrived with orders: redraw the map of Wittersheim using proper cartographic methods, and more importantly, orient it correctly. That meant north on top, grid lines aligned to meridians, and every village road neatly labeled with coordinates. What the commission didn't realize is that the 1699 map they were replacing had been drawn with south at the top, which due to its consistent use had shaped how locals understood their landscape for generations. So when the new map rotated everything 180 degrees, the border line between the two noble regions now cut through a shared grain storage building. Neither noble agreed who owned it anymore. The dispute would last 27 years. When direction meant identity, this was not just a cartographic error, it was a cultural one. The residents of Wittersheim had grown up with a map where up meant south. Their directions, land records, and even family lore all pointed that way. Now, a stranger with a compass and a salary was telling them that up was actually north, and that everything they knew about their world was off by 180 degrees. A schoolteacher from the town, writing in frustration in 1767, described the confusion. The children no longer know which side of the village is the morning side. Even the birds fly wrong. The map has made fools of us all. It seems exaggerated, of course, but also deeply human. We don't just locate ourselves by compass points. We locate ourselves through memory, experience, and repetition. And when those anchors shift, disorientation can feel like erasure. Mapping empires with straight lines. As empires grew more centralized, especially in the wake of the Enlightenment, they desired straight lines and neat borders. Curving rivers and crooked village paths were reinterpreted as problems to be solved especially by surveyors trained in new mathematical techniques. The goal was to tame the landscape, to rule it from afar. In France, the Cassini family had been working since the late 17th century on an ambitious project. The first topographic map of the entire country, drawn to scale, aligned to meridians and parallels. The Cassini maps were revolutionary in many ways, but one feature stood out. They demanded that all maps be aligned with north at the top. No exceptions. Surveyors were given strict instructions. If local landscapes did not fit the grid did not change, the landscape did. This meant that in some villages, roads were mislabeled or distorted to conform to the official map. Hills were placed slightly off location. Forests appeared larger or smaller, depending on how they fit the frame. One might say the land was being slowly reimagined to suit north-facing governance. Colonial cartography, when forgetting north became dangerous. In European colonies, especially in Africa and South Asia, the imposition of north-oriented maps had even more drastic consequences. British colonial surveyors in India, working on the Great Trigonometrical Survey, 1802-1871, were obsessed with precision. They wanted every peak, valley, and road cataloged on gridded sheets with north at the top. These maps weren't just for curiosity, they enabled taxation, military movement, and resource extraction. But local landowners and villagers often kept their own maps drawn in sand or chalk, with rivers curved according to memory and landmarks like the mango tree that split in the rains of '43. These maps were living documents, and few cared whether north was up or down. When the official surveys displaced these local maps, communities lost more than orientation, they lost their autonomy. In parts of Africa, the situation was worse. During the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, European powers drew boundaries across the continent using north-facing maps that ignored ethnic groups, river systems, and trade paths. They didn't forget North they enforced it at the expense of everything else. And thus, North became a colonizing force. The cartographers' revolt and quiet compromises. Not every mapmaker agreed with this forced uniformity. In fact, there were quiet rebellions. Some German atlas publishers in the 19th century began producing reversible maps printed on translucent paper with instructions. Flip for local orientation. A few Russian cartographers, serving remote Siberian regions, drew maps with east or west on top, depending on migration patterns. There was even an eccentric British cartographer, Elias Trowbridge, who in 1841 published an upside-down atlas of the world with south on top. His argument: the concept of up is arbitrary, and northern superiority is a cultural illusion. The atlas sold poorly, and he was quietly dismissed from his university post. But a few copies remain in dusty corners of libraries, tilted sideways on shelves. These acts of resistance didn't overturn the magnetic consensus, but they served as reminders that maps are not mirrors. They are choices, interpretations, frames around a shifting reality. The modern-day relics of misoriented maps. You can still find old town maps in parts of Central Europe where churches are placed at the top, no matter their actual location. Some farmers in northern Italy still refer to field directions as toward the hills or away from the river, rather than north or south. In one peculiar case in France, a village refused to update its tourist maps to the modern style because, according to the mayor, north means little when all roads lead to cheese. Even digital mapping systems, with their pin-sharp accuracy, occasionally honor these old habits. In Google Maps, some layers auto-rotate to match the user's orientation, mirroring the pre-compass instinct of turning the world to match your own view. The truth is, we may never fully forget north again, but neither will we be entirely ruled by it. As the struggle between local wisdom and imposed direction played out across centuries, one must wonder: if maps shape how we see the world, what unseen corners have we turned away from simply because they weren't at the top? From magnetic needle to mental default. By the turn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. North was no longer up for debate, it was simply up. The globe, now modeled for classrooms, railways, military strategy, and empire, defaulted to a single orientation. No more rotating parchments. No more local customs about sunrise side or temple-top layouts. The magnetic needle wasn't just a tool anymore, it had become a symbol of truth. Cartographers, surveyors, and schoolchildren alike began to associate north not only with accuracy, but with authority. The map had stabilized, or so it seemed. But what happens when the map becomes more real than the territory? The quiet death of local geographies. In the hills of rural Hungary, in a place called Nagrad, an old man once guided surveyors using only his memory and the shadows of the hills. His knowledge, passed down through generations, didn't rely on maps at all, only on time, sun, and repetition. But by 1907, the county required a formal cadastral survey. Land boundaries had to be codified. Ownership needed to be legible to taxation authorities, and for that, they brought a map. North was at the top, as expected. The old man looked at it in silence. After a long pause, he asked, "Why is the world upside down?" The map showed the village, yes, but the woods were in the wrong place. The hills were inverted. The road from the river bent in a direction he found impossible. His world hadn't changed, but the way the state saw his world had, and that would make all the difference. From that moment on, his orientation, his understanding of the land was no longer recognized. The state could only read coordinates, not memories. This is the quiet tragedy of standardized mapping. It brings clarity and control, but at the cost of intimate, lived geography. World wars and the battle for precision. During both world wars, maps became not just tools of exploration, but instruments of survival. Military cartography reached levels of precision previously unimaginable. Reconnaissance photography, triangulation towers, and contour lines became essential. And always, North was at the top. In the Second World War, Allied pilots carried meticulously drawn escape maps printed on silk, lightweight and water-resistant. These maps were tiny, accurate, and consistent in orientation. In many cases, they saved lives. A single directional error could mean capture or death. But at the same time, resistance fighters in the forests of Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia often operated without standard maps. They navigated by moonlight, memory, and word of mouth. They built cognitive maps where North was irrelevant. In a way, both systems coexisted, one cold and precise, the other warm and intuitive. And once again, one was disappearing. Upside down, the forgotten challenge to the world map. In 1979, an Australian schoolteacher named Stuart MacArthur published what would become a cult classic among cartographic dissenters, MacArthur's Universal Corrective Map of the World. It placed the South Pole at the top and Australia front and center. He had grown tired of seeing his homeland pushed to the bottom of every map as though it were an afterthought, a footnote to Europe and North America. His goal wasn't to change geography, but to challenge perception. The map's caption read, "Why should North be up? It's a cultural decision, not a geographical one." It sparked curiosity, laughter, and mild academic debate. Some geographers applauded it, others dismissed it as gimmickry. But it planted a seed. What if the North on top worldview had obscured more than it revealed? Modern maps, digital rotations. With the rise of GPS and digital cartography, a curious thing happened. Orientation became fluid again. Apps like Google Maps, Apple Maps, and Waze began auto-rotating maps to match the user's movement. The phone in your hand no longer fixed north at the top, it fixed you. If you're walking south, the map spins south up. If you turn, it turns. In some ways, it mirrors the ancient instinct of orienting by body, not compass. In aviation and maritime navigation, heading up displays are now common. Pilots don't always fly with north on top, they fly with their direction on top. The world turns as they do. It's as though digital tools have reintroduced what early map makers knew intuitively, that maps serve people, not the other way around. Echoes in education and culture. In classrooms across the world maps are still shown north up. Most children assume that's the natural order. Few are told that it's simply tradition. But cracks are forming in the convention. In Latin America, Africa, and the Pacific, alternative map projections are being introduced, maps that decenter Europe, that rotate the world to new frames of reference. The Gall-Peters projection, for instance, preserves area over shape, challenging the dominant Mercator projection, which grossly enlarges Europe and shrinks equatorial regions. These maps don't ignore North, but they don't worship it either. They invite reflection: whose world is at the top, and why? The legacy of the forgotten mapmakers. So what became of the surveyors who forgot or rejected North? Their maps still exist, hidden in archives, brittle with age. They're often treated as curiosities, side notes to official cartography. But in truth, they tell us something essential about how humans navigate the world. That orientation is not just magnetic, but personal. That truth, when imposed too rigidly, can erase other truths. That mapping is a form of storytelling, and every story has a perspective. In a museum in Lisbon, an old porcelain chart still hangs under dim light. Its compass rose is oversized and garishly colored. North is nowhere in sight. The coastlines bend gently, lovingly, shaped by trade winds and sailor tallies. There is no grid, no certainty, only direction as it was once understood, in motion. And maybe that's where the forgotten mapmakers belong, not beneath us, as outdated thinkers, but beside us, reminding us that the world can be drawn many ways and still be true. Closing reflection. We rarely question the shape of the world hanging on our walls. We assume the top is north, the bottom is south. But these are choices, not laws. For centuries, people lived, farmed, and fought without needing to know which way the needle pointed. And perhaps, when trying to understand history, identity, or even ourselves, it's worth asking, if we turned the map upside down, what else might we finally see? Story 2. Letters that took decades. The history of delayed mail. A letter is never just a letter. It begins, perhaps, with a piece of parchment and a trembling hand. A message is written in candlelight. It might contain a debt owed, a declaration of love, a complaint to the crown, or a recipe meant for a cousin in another province. The letter is folded, sealed sometimes with wax, sometimes with string, and entrusted to someone who may or may not know how to read. And then it waits. If history had a pulse, it would beat at the pace of a courier's footsteps, the hoof of a tired horse, or the slow roll of a carriage wheel through mud. Before telegrams, before radio signals, and centuries before email, letters were the only connective tissue between hearts and states. But they were not swift, not at all. Delayed mail is not a failure of communication. It is communication on human time filled with weather, wars, and the unreliability of men with satchels. And in these long silences, lives shifted. The early messengers, memory on horseback. Before formal postal systems existed, message delivery relied on a patchwork of travelers, pilgrims, soldiers, and merchants. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets were wrapped in envelopes of more clay and carried by runners. The Persians used the chaparkhane, a royal courier system so respected that Herodotus marveled at its speed, though even then, speed meant days, not minutes. In ancient Rome, the cursus publicus served emperors and officials. Letters could travel impressive distances up to 50 miles a day, but only for those who wielded authority. If you were a merchant or a widow, you relied on luck and trust. Perhaps you handed your letter to a trader bound for the city, or to a monk traveling to a distant abbey. Maybe it would arrive, maybe it wouldn't. Messages could be mislaid, misread, or simply forgotten in someone's cloak. There are stories quiet, rarely told of letters found decades later, still sealed, their contents rendered irrelevant by the passage of time. In an age when information traveled no faster than the body carrying it, every message was a gamble. When the mail was purposefully slow, slowness was sometimes built in by design. In medieval Europe, no unified postal service existed for common folk. Letters traveled via messenger chains, a mix of private couriers, university porters, and church officials. A letter from Paris to Florence might pass through 10 different hands, each adding time, each possibly opening it for a curious peek. Some universities, like Oxford and Bologna, developed their own internal post systems mainly to exchange academic letters and theological treatises. But these messages moved with all the urgency of scholars deep in debate, slowly, deliberately, and often after long periods of silence. In the 14th century, a scribe named Theodoric from Prague complained that it took 6 months for a reply to reach him from Krakow. He added bitterly, "By the time your words arrived, my question had ceased to be." The Habsburg postal empire, bureaucracy by mail. As European states centralized, so too did their communications. In 1490, Franz von Taxis was commissioned by the Habsburgs to establish a permanent postal system, one that would connect the vast, unwieldy reaches of the empire. Thus was born the Thurn and Taxis Post, a family-run service that would dominate mail for over 300 years. They built relay stations every 20-30 miles, where fresh horses and riders awaited. Letters carried official seals and traveled on marked routes, but even this innovation had limits. Poor roads, wars, snow, and illness delayed correspondence constantly. One archivist in Vienna recorded that a single diplomatic pouch from Brussels took 3 years to arrive misdirected, rerouted, and finally forgotten, until it was discovered in the bottom of a saddlebag. Even within this postal revolution, speed remained relative. For the peasant waiting to hear if his son survived conscription, or the merchant in Prague awaiting word of a shipment lost in the Adriatic, weeks could turn into years. And sometimes, the letter that finally arrived bore only bad news. The art of waiting and writing accordingly. Writers of the pre-modern era understood delay intimately. Their letters read like small treatises on uncertainty. Consider this opening from a 17th century letter, found in the archives of a German monastery. If this reaches you, I shall be comforted. If it does not, may the wind carry my thoughts instead. Or this from a Venetian merchant writing to his brother in Aleppo. I suspect my last 3 letters have not found you. Therefore, I repeat what matters, though my fingers grow tired and my ink runs thin. Writers often included duplicated content across multiple letters, or asked the recipient to confirm receipt in painstaking detail, creating a labyrinth of correspondence meant to outwit fate. They assumed delay. They planned for it. To live in such a world was to accept that information aged, just like bread or milk. A letter's relevance had a shelf life, and beyond that it became history. War and the black holes of communication. During times of war, postal delays took on a haunting quality. Letters disappeared not just for weeks but for lifetimes. Many never reached their destination. In the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, armies moved across Central Europe with brutal speed, but letters often trailed behind by months. Soldiers wrote to sweethearts who had already fled. Families received last words from men long buried. One letter, now preserved in the Swedish National Archives, was mailed from a battlefield in 1641, but did not arrive until 1649, delivered to a widow who had since remarried. The message: "I will return before summer's end." The irony of such a message arriving 8 years too late is difficult to overstate. There is no record of how she responded. When the postal delay became the story. In 1904, a letter sent from a remote Scottish island finally arrived in Edinburgh 41 years late. The envelope was yellowed, the ink faded. Inside, a wedding invitation from 1863. The addressee had died in 1889. Local papers called it the ghost letter. There are other stories like this, scattered across archives and anecdote. A French postcard delivered after 69 years. A letter to a soldier lost in the trenches of the Somme, finally forwarded to his great-granddaughter in the 1980s. These are not isolated errors. They are echoes of a time when the mail moved slowly enough for life itself to get in the way. And yet the system worked. Despite the delays, confusion, and occasional disasters, the global letter system endured. It expanded. It adapted. Over time, reforms came. The penny post in Britain made mail affordable and systematic. The Universal Postal Union, established in 1874, standardized international mail protocols. Innovations like postmarks, dead letter offices, and mail trains increased reliability. Still, the essence of mail remained, a message sent in hope with no guarantee. Even now, in a world of instant messages and delivery tracking, letters still get lost, and some still arrive decades late, like slow ghosts from a forgotten past. As you listen to the slow shuffle of postal history, you may find yourself wondering, what messages were never read, simply because they arrived after the moment had passed? The dead letter office, where hope was sorted. Imagine a building filled with undelivered hopes. In the 19th century, postal systems across the world began to formalize a concept that had already existed unofficially: the dead letter office. These were special departments within the National Postal Services, tasked with handling mail that could not be delivered and had no clear return address. In Britain, it was officially named the Returned Letter Office, later part of the General Post Office, while in the United States it became the Dead Letter Office, a term that would haunt the bureaucratic imagination. Each year, millions of letters passed through these offices. Some were returned, others were open to locate a clue, and some were never claimed, never sent forward, never known. In many ways, this is where the stories of forgotten mail become most human, because the letters were there, physically present but unreachable, and their words, however urgent or heartfelt, no longer had a reader. The forgotten lives inside envelopes. The Dead Letter Office became a strange kind of archive. Clerks cataloged and occasionally read unclaimed letters, especially if the contents could identify the sender or receiver. They handled everything from unpaid love confessions to overdue bills, from wedding invitations to pleas for help. In Washington, D.C., one such office by the 1880s was processing over 20,000 pieces of mail per day. Many contained small objects: a pair of gloves, a coin, a ring, a scrap of fabric from a child's blanket. These enclosures were often emotional keys to the message and frequently all that was left. The letters were stored in boxes labeled by type: no address, insufficient postage, illegible, deceased addressee. In 1893, a clerk reported receiving a letter simply addressed, "To my son, wherever you are." No return address, no postmark, just a trembling hand and an ocean of hope. Mail that crossed generations. Not all delayed mail stayed forever undelivered. In 2006, a letter was delivered to a woman in Michigan. It had been postmarked in 1950, addressed to her grandmother. Somehow, it had vanished into the postal ether for 56 years before being found in a post office renovation project. It was an invitation to a dinner that had long since occurred, and the sender had long since died. The woman read it anyway. There is something gently haunting in such stories. The time lag makes the letter feel like a time capsule, a voice not silenced, but simply late. Postal bottlenecks, bureaucracy, empire, and the geography of delay. Mail delays weren't always caused by natural forces. Many were born of bureaucratic logic systems meant to organize information that inadvertently buried it. In the British Raj, mail had to pass through multiple verification layers. Letters written in regional languages were often delayed by days or weeks while translators were sourced. Others were held at colonial offices to be reviewed, especially if political or religious in nature. In the Ottoman Empire, censorship played a significant role. Entire bags of mail could be held up for review, and anything considered inflammatory might be discarded outright. That meant love letters, family correspondence, and even recipe exchanges could be tangled in red tape for months. In World War I, Austrian soldiers on the Eastern Front often waited weeks for letters from home, not due to distance alone, but due to military mail review boards, which monitored for morale-damaging content. Postal inspectors didn't just read letters, they slowed them down, and in the process, sometimes rewrote the life they were supposed to inform. The curious case of delayed mourning. One of the most tragic effects of delayed mail is delayed grief. In 1916, a farmer in County Clare, Ireland, received a letter from his son who had emigrated to America. It was filled with optimism, a job secured, plans to send money back. The father wrote a reply, but weeks passed with no further word. Months, years. It wasn't until 1919 that a neighbor, returning from Liverpool, brought with him a newspaper clipping. The son had died in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. The final letter from the son arrived in 1920, misrouted through Liverpool, Manchester, and Dublin. On the envelope, 6 forwarding addresses had been crossed out. It was water-stained and bore the official stamp, found in Mail Recovery Depot. The father kept it unopened until he died. Slow news, big consequences. In 1815, a message delay famously influenced world history. The Battle of New Orleans, fought after the War of 1812, had officially ended. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed in December 1814, effectively ending hostilities between Britain and the United States. But news of the treaty did not reach U.S. shores quickly enough. On January 8, 1815, 2 weeks later, General Andrew Jackson led American forces to a bloody victory against the British. Over 2,000 men were killed or wounded in a battle that didn't need to happen, and it did all because the mail moved too slowly. It was a sobering lesson. Information delay could cost lives. Unclaimed letters, unlived lives. In Paris in the 1840s, a young woman named Claire wrote weekly letters to her fiancé, who had left for Lyon to pursue a government post. She sent over 50 letters in a year. She never received a reply. Heartbroken and convinced she'd been abandoned, she eventually married someone else. Decades later, during renovations at a post office in Lyon, a sealed drawer was found inside a rotted desk. It contained dozens of unopened letters, all addressed to the same man, Claire's fiancé. His forwarding address had changed, and a careless clerk had failed to reassign the mail. The man, according to city records, died in 1846, still listed as unmarried. Postmarks as fossils. Postmarks became crucial in the 19th century, not just to verify mailing dates, but to track historical movement. A letter might be postmarked in London, redirected through Calais, detoured through Marseille due to weather, then rerouted to Munich before reaching Vienna. Philatelist stamp collectors eventually began preserving envelopes and marks, creating a new branch of historical record, postal archaeology. Some postmarks tell long, sad stories. A letter postmarked 1942 in Warsaw but never received in Tel Aviv. Another from 1945, mailed from Tokyo days before the atomic bomb, found years later in a metal box buried underground. The marks outlasted the context. They are like fossils, traces of connection, attempts that the world never quite fulfilled. What is a letter, really? A letter is more than words on paper. It is an intent, an act of reaching. In a pre-digital world, that act was weighted with uncertainty. The delay between writing and reception was part of the ritual. Some writers embraced this. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that time is part of the message. To wait is to show trust. To reply is to honor the wait. Others struggled. There are diaries filled with laments about the missing letter, the silence that grew too long. And yet, even with delay and disappointment, the world continued to send mail. The risk was worth it, because even if letters arrived late, they arrived. And in that, there was still meaning. In a world where a message could arrive days, years, or lifetimes too late, we are left to wonder. How many fates were changed, not by the message itself, but by the moment it was received? When the letter becomes a monument. In many ways, the most powerful letters are the ones that arrive late. Not because of their content, but because of their context, the knowledge that the message was meant for another time, another moment, a window that has since closed. There's something ghostly about reading a letter that was supposed to arrive while you were still deciding, still grieving, still waiting. By the time it's read, the choices have been made. The life has unfolded. And yet these letters still speak. Not as instruction or comfort or demand, but as echo, a fossil of human connection. The final part of our journey through the history of delayed mail is not about the mechanics of delivery or the systems of state. It is about the effect on people, on memory, and even on how we write. Letters received after death. Perhaps the most wrenching examples of delayed mail are those that arrive after death. In 1946, A woman named Yvette Dubois in Rouen, France, received a letter from her husband, a prisoner of war in Germany. It had been mailed in 1943. For 3 years it had moved from camp to camp, office to office, rerouted again and again. Her husband had died in early 1945. She had already mourned, already buried his keepsakes, and yet here now was his handwriting, casual, hopeful, alive. He wrote, "If the weather holds, I think we'll be moved by Easter. I dream of your soup. Tell the children I've been collecting bottle caps for them." Yvette read it once, then placed it in a small box marked "Too Late." She never opened that box again. The letter that saved a village, eventually. Not all delayed letters were sad. Some carried small miracles just in time, even if technically too late. In 1921, a village in Romania faced the forced eviction of hundreds of families due to a land ownership dispute. The original title deed to the land, granted by a now-defunct principality, had been lost. The government prepared to reassign the land to an industrial developer. Then, in 1922, a letter from 1899 arrived at a regional court. Inside, a copy of the deed, sent by a relative who had emigrated to Argentina and wanted to ensure the family had proof. The letter had been misfiled in a consulate pouch and stored in a box never opened until that year. It arrived a week before the eviction deadline. The family stayed. The factory was never built, and in the village's archive today, the letter is displayed under glass not because it was profound, but because it showed up. The politics of postal delay. Late letters are not always accidental. In regimes where control of information is paramount, mail is power. Delays can be used strategically to slow descent, to interrupt momentum, to erase urgency. In East Germany, the Stasi systematically opened and delayed mail, particularly between citizens and those in the West. Letters from mothers to children or lovers separated by the Berlin Wall could be held for weeks, even months. Sometimes they were rewritten. Sometimes they disappeared entirely. In apartheid-era South Africa, mail to political prisoners was heavily censored. Letters from loved ones might arrive with blacked-out sentences. Others were lost. Some reappeared years later when the political climate changed and the need for silence had passed. These delays were not mistakes, they were policy. And they left scars: confusion, mistrust, the gnawing doubt that perhaps the letter was never sent at all. Letters in bottles and the myth of arrival. Some letters were never meant to be delivered, or rather, their delivery was left to chance. The phenomenon of letters in bottles dates back centuries, messages cast into the sea with little hope, but immense symbolism. One of the oldest known examples dates to 1784, when a German seaman tossed a corked bottle into the Baltic with a message of farewell. It was found 201 years later, in 1985, by a fisherman. In 1914, a British soldier aboard the RMS Lusitania wrote a short note to his wife, sealed it in a bottle, and threw it into the Atlantic. The ship was later sunk by a German U-boat. The bottle washed ashore in Ireland a year later. His widow received it long after his funeral. The bottle is not just a vessel, it is a delay made visible. A metaphor for all the messages we send into the world, unsure who or when might answer. Modern delays, the mail is still late. Despite our advances, letters still go missing. They still arrive in strange loops of time. In 2021, a woman in London received a Christmas card from her sister. It was dated 1995. The envelope had no damage. The stamp was still valid. And yet, somewhere in the Royal Mail system, it had waited 26 years. No one could explain it. In another case, a letter mailed in 1915 from a World War I trench arrived at a Yorkshire home in 2013, 98 years later. The soldier who sent it had died 2 days after writing it. The letter was addressed to a Miss A. West. No one in the house knew her, but the current resident, upon reading it, wept. It was like hearing someone's last breath. The emotional geography of delay. There is a strange intimacy in a late letter. Even if its content is outdated, it carries the shape of a voice, the rhythm of a time you can no longer enter. It reminds us that language is not always timely, that sometimes we speak too late or too early. That meaning has a shelf life and yet also a lingering shadow. A letter delayed can hurt, but it can also heal. It can close a wound you thought would stay open or reopen one you believed long scarred. Because sometimes a message doesn't need to change anything. It just needs to be read. Final reflections, the weight of paper. The modern world often treats paper as obsolete. We send texts, emails, voice notes. Messages move at the speed of light. If they are delayed, we grow impatient. We expect confirmation, delivery, read receipts. But the old letter, the kind that could take weeks, years, or lifetimes to arrive, offered something else: patience. It asked the writer to consider their words carefully. It asked the reader to receive them generously. And it asked both to accept that life might intervene, that the message might not arrive, that it might arrive too late, that it might arrive exactly when it needed to. Closing reflection. As we fold up this story, perhaps you might ask, if someone wrote you a letter today, but it took 30 years to reach you, what might you hope it says? Story 3. The Quiet Life of Standardized Time. Before time was a line, you live in a world where time ticks in perfect order. The seconds on your watch match the seconds on your phone. The news arrives at 6:00 p.m. in one city and 6:00 p.m. in another, adjusted perfectly by zones. When someone says noon, you know exactly what they mean. But it wasn't always like that. For most of history, time was personal. It belonged to the sky, to the church bells, to the rising of bread and the shadow of a tree. The idea that everyone, everywhere, should agree on what hour it was would have struck people as, frankly, unnecessary. Time used to be slow, local, and wonderfully inconsistent. This is the story of how it became otherwise. The church bell and the village clock. In the 1600s, if you stood in a square in rural France and asked someone the time, they might point to the bell tower and shrug. Whatever time the priest said it was, that's what time it was. In England, a man might say, "It's 2 hours past sunrise," or "It's nearing evening prayer." Time was not measured in digits but in events, and these events shifted with the seasons. Even as mechanical clocks began to spread in the 14th and 15th centuries, they were often inaccurate and uncoordinated. A town might have a clock tower, but it wasn't synchronized with the village 2 miles away. Why would it be? There was no real need. No one traveled fast enough for time differences to matter. Until they did. The coming of the train. The train changed everything. By the 1830s, railroads were crisscrossing Britain, shrinking travel times dramatically. A journey that once took 2 days by carriage now took 6 hours by rail. Suddenly, it mattered whether the train left at 10:15 or 10:20, and whether the time on your ticket matched the time on the station clock. But here was the problem: every town still kept its own time. So when a train left London, it departed on London time. When it arrived in Bristol, it entered a city running Bristol time, which was about 11 minutes behind. And if it continued to Exeter, it encountered Exeter time, another few minutes adrift. Railway companies began to suffer scheduling chaos. Trains missed connections. Conductors were confused. Passengers arrived on time and still missed their trains because the platform clock and the town clock disagreed. The solution was simple, radical, and profoundly boring. Everyone must agree on time. Greenwich time, order from above. In 1847, most British railway companies adopted a standard based on the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. This Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, would become the official railway time, even if it wasn't the local time in the towns the trains served. At first, this caused friction. Local governments didn't want to abandon their town clocks. Church officials complained. Some newspapers criticized the shift as unnatural, even imperial. Why should Bristol surrender its 11-minute difference to the tyranny of London? But efficiency won. By 1855, over 95% of public clocks in Britain were running on railway time. The country had surrendered to the tick of a single clock. A world out of sync. While Britain led the charge, other countries struggled with standard time in different ways. In the United States, things were far worse. By 1880, there were over 300 local time zones in operation. Each city and town observed its own time based on solar noon, when the sun was directly overhead. A railroad timetable from this period looks more like a puzzle than a schedule. To travel from Chicago to New York, a passenger might cross dozens of time discrepancies, each requiring adjustment. Train stations sometimes posted 2 clocks, one for local time and one for railway time. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Collisions began to happen due to mismatched timekeeping. In 1853, a fatal train crash in New England prompted calls for standardization, but it would take decades to organize. The daytime changed. On November 18, 1883, known as the Day of Two Noons, the United States enacted a radical shift. 4 standard time zones, each an hour apart, based loosely on longitude. At noon that day, telegraph lines buzzed with signals and clocks were adjusted from coast to coast. Some were moved forward, some backward. For a few moments, time stood in limbo. It was the first moment in history when entire cities reset their clocks by instruction, not by sky. Newspapers reported confusion. In some towns, citizens gathered in the square to watch the change. In others, people ignored it. One preacher called it a man-made sin against God's time. But gradually, the new zones settled in. Time, once wild and local, was now boxed, measured, and distributed like grain. The psychological shift. Standardized time did more than smooth railway schedules, it changed how people thought. Once time was something you lived within. Now it became something you obeyed. Clocks moved from church towers into homes. Factory whistles dictated work shifts. School bells divided the day into periods. Governments used time to structure everything from court appointments to tax deadlines. This shift gave rise to clock discipline, a term used by historians to describe how people internalized punctuality. You weren't late because of the sun. You were late because the clock said so. For the first time, time could accuse you. The small resistances. Not everyone embraced standard time. Some rural communities refused to change their clocks for decades. In parts of India, Bombay time persisted even after the British imposed Indian Standard Time. The two were 39 minutes apart, and locals preferred their own rhythm. In Newfoundland, Canada, a unique time offset of 30 minutes was adopted to distinguish it from both British and Canadian time zones. It still exists today. Even today, pockets of resistance remain. In Australia, some regions refuse daylight saving time. In Indiana, for years, counties debated which zone they belonged to and whether they should spring forward or not. Time is supposed to be neutral, but as history shows, it is political, practical, and deeply personal. As you drift through the quiet corridors of this story, you may find yourself wondering, if time had remained local, would we move more slowly, or would we simply find new ways to disagree? Time as territory. Time, once the soft unfolding of sunlight across a hillside, became, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a gridded abstraction divided into zones, enforced by governments and enforced down to the second. It had to be. The world was getting faster. Telegraph cables crisscrossed oceans. Steamships adhered to tight schedules. Stock markets opened and closed according to ticking clocks in distant cities. War and diplomacy relied on synchronized maneuvers. But this transformation was neither smooth nor simple. To standardize time meant to erase certain ways of being. It required old rhythms to yield to new rules. Time became not just something you followed, but something that followed you back, with authority and precision. The telegraph and the shrinking world. Before the telegraph, information traveled at the speed of a horse, a boat, or a man on foot. You couldn't know what was happening in another city until someone physically brought you the news. The telegraph changed that. With dots and dashes traveling along wires, instantaneous communication became possible. And with it came an unsettling paradox. Information could now arrive before time itself caught up. For example, a message sent from Paris to Vienna might arrive in the same moment it was sent, but if local clocks differed, it might appear to have arrived before it was written. In 1847, this discrepancy caused confusion in a legal case when a time-stamped message suggested a contract was agreed upon before it was proposed. The solution, again, was the synchronization of clocks not just locally, but internationally. Telegraph companies began to pressure governments to fix time. The resulting reforms weren't just practical, they represented a shift in who owned time, no longer nature nor community but infrastructure. The International Meridian Conference, carving the hours. In October 1884, delegates from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C., for a conference that would decide something deceptively simple. Where should time begin? This was the International Meridian Conference, and its purpose was to choose a prime meridian, a line of zero, longitude from which time could be globally measured. The debate was heated. France wanted Paris. Others proposed Rome, Washington, even Jerusalem. Ultimately, the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England, was chosen. The reasoning: most naval charts already used Greenwich, thanks to Britain's maritime dominance. And so Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, was born not just as a British tradition, but as the world's clock. The conference also proposed dividing the globe into 24 time zones, each spanning roughly 15 degrees of longitude. But adoption was uneven. France, for instance, refused to use GMT officially until 1911. Time had been gridded, but the world was slow to fall in line. Time in the colonies. Standard time, like railways and telegraphs, was a tool of empire. In British India, Indian Standard Time (IST) was introduced in 1906, but the country was so vast that a single time zone made little sense. Bombay time was 39 minutes behind IST. Calcutta used its own standard. Confusion reigned. Still, the British pushed for uniformity, not because it made life easier for locals, but because it made administration more efficient. Trains, taxes, and troop movements all benefited from synchronized time. But for farmers and laborers who rose with the sun and slept with the dark, the new clocks meant little. In Africa, similar patterns emerged. European colonizers imposed time zones that suited railway schedules and military strategy, not local geography or customs. Time, once a shared community rhythm, was now a colonial overlay, ticking away regardless of the sky. Timekeeping and resistance. Despite the global march of standardized time, resistance persisted, sometimes quiet, sometimes clever. In rural Ireland, long after GMT was adopted, villagers continued using sun time for daily life. A clock might say noon, but the cow would still be milked when its shadow reached the well. In Sicily, older men carried pocket watches that ran 5 or 10 minutes fast, not by accident, but as a kind of personal buffer against the modern world. Even in industrial cities, Office time and home time could diverge. A factory worker might keep two watches, one for punching in, one for living. In China, which geographically spans 5 time zones, the government enforces a single national time, Beijing time. This means that in the far west, the sun may not rise until 10 a.m., and it's still light outside at midnight. Locals in regions like Xinjiang use unofficial local time, 2 hours behind the official clock. This quiet defiance continues 2 times in one country, side by side. Daylight saving time, time seasonal stretching. No discussion of standardized time is complete without the strange experiment known as daylight saving time, DST. First implemented in Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1916, during World War I, DST was designed to conserve coal by extending evening daylight. Other countries followed: Britain, France, and eventually the US. But the idea was not new. Benjamin Franklin, in 1784, jokingly proposed waking up earlier to save candles. His satire later became policy. The impact of DST has always been mixed. While it may save energy in theory, it disrupts sleep patterns, confuses schedules, and more than once wrecked train timetables and election polling hours. In 1999, the West Bank and Israel briefly operated on different daylight-saving schedules, leading to a tragic error when a bomb's timer was set incorrectly. Even today, countries debate DST usefulness. Some abandon it entirely, others embrace it. In a world obsessed with precision, time remains strangely malleable. The atomic clock, when time became absolute. If the 19th century was about synchronizing time, the 20th century was about perfecting it. Enter the atomic clock. First developed in 1949, atomic clocks measure time based on the vibrations of atoms, specifically cesium-133. These vibrations are so consistent that atomic time is accurate to within 1 second every 100 million years. This level of precision birthed Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, the standard used globally today. UTC doesn't rely on the sun, it's based on cesium, on atoms, on physics. And yet the Earth doesn't rotate perfectly. It wobbles. It slows. To account for this, we add occasional leap seconds, moments when the clock pauses ever so slightly to let the planet catch up. Even now, with all our tools, the Earth resists total alignment. The feeling of time. In standardizing time, we gained much: precision, coordination, efficiency. But we also lost something. We lost the sense that time could be hours shaped by place, by season, by community. That 2 towns a few miles apart might live in different rhythms. That the baker's morning was not the blacksmith's. That noon didn't arrive with a bell, but with the smell of roasting barley or the angle of a window's light. Now time feels uniform, often invisible. It arrives through digital screens. It vibrates in your pocket. It blinks on the wall. But in a way, it's also grown quieter, more distant, less felt. As clocks were standardized and time was distributed like a product, a question was quietly buried beneath the ticking. Did we master time or merely submit to it altogether? A world that ticks together. At some point in the early 20th century, the hum of machines joined the ticking of clocks. Time moved from the church steeple and the railway station into every home, every wrist, every pocket. It became routine, inescapable, normal. Children learned to read time as they learned to read letters. Factories rang bells. Radios broadcast the hour. Later, television signed off each night with the national anthem and the clock face. And yet, almost unnoticed, we had done something profound. We had surrendered time to systems. The revolution of standardized time did not arrive with thunder or gunfire. It arrived with scheduling, with silence, with the quiet acceptance that we must all agree, even if only to avoid missing our trains. Clock time and the rise of the office. By the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, timekeeping became central to daily life not just for movement, but for productivity. The 9-to-5 workday, a remnant of industrial scheduling, spread like gospel, not because it was natural but because it was measurable. Wages were calculated by hours, efficiency by minutes, time sheets became contracts, calendars became battlegrounds. In the office tower and the classroom, clock time became law. Tardiness was a form of failure. Losing track of time was no longer quaint, it was irresponsible. In 1950s America, the new suburbs lived by commuter train schedules and synchronized alarm clocks. Time wasn't something you had, it was something you followed. A day began not with dawn but with a buzz. It ended not with dusk but with the evening news. And somewhere along the way, time became an employer. The strange power of time zones. Time zones, those quiet dividers of geography, began to shape more than just clocks. They began to shape identity. In the Soviet Union, all 12 time zones were eventually centralized under Moscow time for military and political coherence. This meant that in some Far Eastern regions, the local time was absurdly misaligned with daylight. But the message was clear: Moscow determines the hour. In the United States, television began shaping social rhythms. National broadcasts synchronized people across zones. You didn't just watch the evening news, you watched it at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. These scheduled moments helped define a shared national culture, but only by reminding everyone where in time they stood. In this way, time zones became both practical and symbolic. They measured distance not only in miles, but in minutes. When the clock breaks, of course, standardized time isn't perfect. When clocks fail or are manipulated, we are reminded of just how fragile timekeeping really is. On New Year's Eve of 1999, the world braced for the Y2K bug, a potential collapse of digital systems due to how computers stored dates. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the panic revealed something unsettling. Our faith in time was software deep. In 2012, a leap second was added to atomic time. Some websites and servers crashed, others stalled. One airline had to ground flights. 1 second disrupted the machinery of the world. These moments remind us, time isn't just a flow, it's a framework, and frameworks can fail. The persistence of local time. Despite globalization, local time endures in quiet ways. In Spain, the daily rhythm runs late. Meals at 10 p.m., television shows at midnight. This is a legacy of Franco-era alignment with Nazi Germany's time zone. Spain shifted from GMT to Central European time in 1940 and never shifted back. A political decision, now a cultural norm. In Nepal, the national time is offset by UTC plus 5, 45 minutes, not a full hour. It's not a mistake, it's a statement. A way of saying, we are not India, we are not anyone else. Our time is our own. And so even today, you find these small resistances, reminders that standardization is never total. Time as memory, time as grief. Standardized time has brought coordination, yes, but also a sense of uniformity. The soft variance of human experience is flattened into units, appointments, countdowns. But in personal life, time still flexes. Ask anyone who has grieved. A minute can last forever. Ask a parent watching a child grow. Years can vanish in a breath. Standard time can tell you what time it is. It cannot tell you what time feels like. That remains a private matter. And no clock, no matter how precise, can truly capture it. The clocks we inherit. In most homes, there is a drawer with an old watch. Perhaps it no longer works. Perhaps it belonged to someone long gone. It is not kept because it tells time, but because it holds time, a piece of someone else's rhythm, long stilled. In museums, clocks from earlier centuries sit behind glass. They are often inaccurate, their gears stiff, but they speak of a world where time was communal, not commercial. A world where bells told you when to gather and shadows told you when to rest. Time wasn't lost in those days, it was simply shared differently. And the move toward standardization, while necessary, reminds us that something was left behind. What happens when time becomes invisible? Today we carry time in our phones, our fitness trackers, our ovens, our microwaves. It is everywhere and nowhere. Because we no longer notice timekeeping, it has become a background hum, ambient, persistent, unquestioned. We say, "What time is it?" but rarely ask, "Whose time is this?" Or, "Why is this the time we keep?" We live by numbers but forget their origin. Forget that every tick is a choice, every time zone a story, every clock a map. A thought to drift on. So now, as you lay listening to this history of clocks, of zones, of quiet surrender, you might find yourself wondering, if we could start again, without schedules or standards, what would your time look like? Would it follow the sun? Or the song of birds? Or something only you could name? Story 4. The Forgotten Language of the Tax Assessors. The tax collector's quiet kingdom. There is a kind of power that doesn't shout. It doesn't ride on horseback or carry a sword. It doesn't conquer cities or lead revolutions. It simply writes things down. And in doing so, it reshapes nations. For thousands of years, the hum of empire has been kept alive not by kings and warriors, but by clerks, the silent, ink-stained army of tax assessors, scribes, and accountants. Their tools were modest, quills, ledgers, wax seals, but their influence was immense. They decided how much you owed. They recorded your land, your livestock, your labor. They put your existence into columns and rows, often in a language only they could understand. This is the forgotten history of those assessors and the strange dialect of governance they developed. The invention of written accountability. The earliest known writing system, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, did not emerge to tell stories or record myths. They emerged to track grain, to document debts, to list what belonged to whom, and how much they owed to the temple or the crown. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets preserved the names of workers, quantities of barley, and fines for failing to meet quotas. These weren't poetic, they were functional, bureaucratic. In a sense, taxation created writing. And from the very beginning, tax assessors used a language that was deliberately obscure, a mix of shorthand, symbols, and local conventions designed to make sense to the trained and only to the trained. This wasn't just administration, it was control. The rise of the assessor class. By the Middle Ages, tax assessment had evolved into a formalized system across much of Europe and Asia. In France, the taille, a direct land tax, required meticulous surveys. In England, the Domesday Book of 1086 was perhaps the most ambitious project of its kind, a comprehensive record of land holdings, livestock, and taxable value. Commissioned by William the Conqueror, the Domesday Book was so detailed and so authoritative that it was said, not a single ox nor pig was left uncounted. It was also written in Latin, in compressed phrases that few peasants could understand. Phrases like, Terra est in manu regis, tenet Wilhelmus de abate, valet ex solidi. The land is in the king's hand, William holds it from the abbot, it is worth 10 shillings. The language was intentionally arcane, part legal necessity, part social barrier. It allowed tax assessors to speak with certainty, while keeping the assessed in the dark. The hidden dialects of debt. As states expanded, so did the complexity of their tax systems, and with it, the evolution of bureaucratic dialects. In the Ottoman Empire, tax records known as Tahrir defters were written in Ottoman Turkish, a linguistic blend of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian that few villagers could read. The script itself, elegant and flowing, masked the harsh realities it contained: crop yields, labor quotas, unpaid fines. In Ming China, officials used a formal script called kaishu for reports, but often annotated records in cursive shorthand that only other officials understood. Even in 19th century Europe, tax codes were riddled with terms like usufruct, quitrend, imputed income, ad valorem. These weren't just words, they were barriers. To navigate the tax world, you needed a guide, a scribe, a notary, or a clerk, and those who knew the language of taxation wielded quiet authority over those who did not. The ledger as weapon. A tax ledger might seem boring, a book of numbers, dry ink, and dust, but in the hands of empire, it was a tool of extraordinary influence. In colonial India, British surveyors used revenue settlement records to redefine land ownership. Villages that had functioned communally for centuries were suddenly forced into named ownership, often recorded under the name of whoever happened to speak English. Entire communities lost land not by force, but by paper. In one case in Punjab in 1874, a family of tenant farmers discovered their land had been reassigned to a tax collector's nephew. Why? Because the ledger said so, and once the ledger spoke, there was no appeal. The language of taxation wasn't just vocabulary, it was jurisdiction. When the taxman couldn't be understood, language barriers weren't always intentional. In multi-ethnic empires, assessors and assessed often spoke different tongues. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, tax codes were printed in German, even in Slavic and Hungarian provinces. In the Russian Empire, Tatar-speaking villagers were taxed using Cyrillic documents they couldn't read. In the Americas, Spanish colonial administrators demanded tribute from indigenous populations using legal Castilian filled with unfamiliar symbols and laws. As a result, confusion reigned. People paid too much or not enough. Some villages disappeared from records altogether. Others were double counted. One tragic example comes from a Polish town in 1812, where a scribe misread an abbreviation for hearths as heads, doubling a family's tax burden based on population rather than stoves. The debt was passed down for 3 generations before being corrected. The scribes who kept the system alive. Behind every tax assessor was a scribe, usually a local man, semi-literate, trained just enough to keep records but not enough to question them. These scribes often walked village to village with ledgers in tow, writing in cramped script, copying figures, adding ink notes in the margins. Family relocated after drought, collect next year. Suspected underreporting, recheck before harvest. Cow missing claim disputed. Their records were dusty but detailed. They were, in effect, human operating systems for the bureaucracies above them. And often their personal shorthand became the standard. A squiggle here, a crossed T there known only to the scribe, and if lucky, his apprentice. To read an old tax ledger today is to read code, not just numbers, but a language that lived only briefly and is now barely understood. The quiet collapse of a language. By the mid-20th century, modern accounting practices and digital systems began replacing traditional ledgers. Paper turned to microfilm. Microfilm turned to hard drives. The clerks who once wrote longhand in candlelight were replaced by typists, then coders, then algorithms. With them, the old language of tax assessors began to fade. Latin abbreviations, Ottoman flourishes, Cyrillic footnotes, margin notes in regional dialects. Gone. Or at best, locked in archives decipherable only to niche historians and idle archivists. Their disappearance was not tragic. It was, like most of bureaucratic history, quiet. But with them went a way of understanding the world, not through law or land or loyalty, but through debt, obligation, and ink. As the forgotten phrases of old tax ledgers gather dust in basements and archives, one question lingers. If the language of power is forgotten, does the power itself disappear or merely find a new voice? What the margins really said. In the ledgers of early modern Europe, the margins tell the real story. A ledger entry might list 10 sheep, 3 cows, and 1 parcel of land, annual value 12 florins. But next to it, in the cramped, near-indecipherable writing of a scribe, you might find widowed, lives alone, children absent, likely unable to pay. Suspect underreporting due to poor barley harvest. Family in poor standing with Reeve, monitor closely. This was not merely bookkeeping, it was profiling. These scribbled phrases weren't official, but they carried great weight. A good or bad note in the margin could determine whether your taxes were reduced, doubled, or sent to collection. These marginalia formed a kind of hidden code, a second layer of governance, subtle, informal, and immensely consequential. Over time, this shorthand evolved into bureaucratic dialects unique to regions, empires, or even individual assessors. And as these codes grew, they created a divide between those who assessed and those who were assessed. The taxman as storyteller. The role of the assessor wasn't just to count and calculate, it was also to narrate. Assessors built portraits of communities. Who was industrious, who was suspect, who was trustworthy. Their evaluations, while dry on the surface, carried moral judgments beneath. In one 17th-century Bavarian tax book, a village miller was recorded as reliable in all years save one, when his temper worsened. That year, his tax was raised. In Transylvania, a family's entry included: their fruit trees produce well, but they speak poorly of the collector. Their tax was doubled the following season. The language of tax was never just numbers. It was a form of soft surveillance, a way of recording loyalty, rebellion, and silence. And the tax assessor, less an accountant than a chronicler of behavior, operating in ink rather than judgment. The power of misinterpretation. Many assessors traveled through territories where they did not speak the local language. Miscommunication was common, and the results could be devastating. In 1819, a Prussian assessor mistook the word for forest in a regional dialect for fertile field. He reclassified an entire slope of pine-covered mountain as farmland. The village's tax rate spiked. When the error was discovered 2 years later, it was quietly ignored. The village had already adapted or perished. In Ottoman Syria, Armenian and Arabic speakers often relied on local interpreters to navigate Turkish-language tax codes. These interpreters became gatekeepers, able to shift fortunes by translating generously or maliciously. Even something as small as a spelling error could shift a person's fate. In 19th-century Italy, an extra mark above a letter changed non-payer into new payer. The family was taxed accordingly for 22 years. Such stories are rarely told in grand histories. They live instead in the margins of ledgers, in penciled corrections, in notes that end in question marks. The multiplication of categories. One of the great innovations and burdens of tax bureaucracy was the categorization of people. Tax assessors began not just listing what people owned, but who they were. Married or widowed, Orthodox or Catholic, merchant or laborer, exempt or taxable, newcomer or native, settled or floating. Each category came with consequences. In the Habsburg Empire, Roma communities were labeled as unstedig, unsettled, and taxed at higher rates. In Qing China, entire classes of artisans were taxed according to skill, producing a complex web of codes that few understood and fewer could challenge. One village in Galicia had 34 distinct tax categories, each with a different rate, exemption, or enforcement method. Many villagers never knew which category they were placed in. They only knew what they were told to pay. And if they asked why, they were shown a ledger full of symbols, abbreviations, and numbers, all written in a language not meant to be read. The secretarial elite. While kings and ministers ruled in name, much of the real power lay with the middle clerical classes. The men who managed the ledgers, translated the edicts, and ensured that taxes flowed. These were not the aristocrats. They were often sons of merchants, minor nobles, or educated peasants, trained in penmanship, arithmetic, and record-keeping. They rose quietly but steadily. In Russia, this class was called the chinovniki, bureaucrats who filled entire ministries with their ink-stained sleeves and unreadable signatures. In Spain, notarios, reals, royal notaries formed a hereditary caste, passing down codes and contracts from father to son. They spoke the language of power, even if they didn't hold the crown. And that language was increasingly bureaucratic Latin, legal Arabic, formal Mandarin, or church Slavonic dialects removed from the streets, the fields, and the people. When the language became a machine. By the early 20th century, tax systems began adopting typewriters, carbon copies, and standardized forms. Columns replaced cursive. Checkboxes replaced commentary. The language of the assessor was no longer handwritten, it was printed, uniform, legible. In some ways, this was progress. Errors became easier to catch, appeals easier to file, but something else was lost: the personal nuance, the tacit agreements, and yes, the biases of the old system. The modern tax form was clean but cold. It asked you to fill in blanks, not tell your story. And for many, the form still spoke a foreign tongue, now not in archaic Latin, but in legalese and bureaucratese, with phrases like line item deduction subject to fiscal threshold recalibration, reportable income contingent upon residency-based asset declaration. The language hadn't disappeared. It had simply mutated from ink to jargon, from scroll to spreadsheet. When bureaucracies forget their own language. Ironically, in some cases, the tax systems became so complex that even the bureaucrats could no longer interpret them. In France, a tax law passed in 1934 referenced a statute from 1895, which in turn cited a code from 1810 written in Napoleonic French. By the 1970s, tax officials admitted that no one fully understood the original basis for a specific agricultural deduction, but they kept applying it. In the United States, IRS code now spans over 70,000 pages, most of it unreadable without legal training. A 2005 audit revealed that different IRS agents gave contradictory answers to the same questions because the code had become self-obscuring. The language of tax assessment, once written in cramped margins and passed from clerk to apprentice, had become a labyrinth without a map. As the silent dialect of taxation grew from ink and parchment to digital codes and auto-filled boxes, one quiet truth remains. If no one understands the language of authority, not even those who speak it, who, then, is really in control? When the ledger outlasts the life. In the archives of Palermo, in a room cooled by centuries of silence, there sits a collection of bound ledgers wrapped in worn red cloth. Each volume lists names now long forgotten. Some are misspelled, some are crossed out, others are followed by short phrases: deceased, disappeared, debtor. But one thing connects them all: they owed something. Long after the people themselves had faded into history, the record of their obligation remained preserved in careful ink strokes that never questioned whether the debt was fair or even possible to collect. The language of tax did not need a living person. It needed a name, a mark, a balance. The ledger was eternal, the debtor expendable. Ghost debtors and inherited errors. In the 18th century, a village in Moldavia experienced an unusual bureaucratic haunting. Generations of a particular family were taxed for 2 oxen and a barley field listed under their name in the imperial register. But the family no longer owned any land, nor did they own oxen. In fact, no one in the village could recall them ever doing so. When a curious local priest investigated, he discovered the tax was based on an entry from 1682, where a scribe had mistakenly added the assets of a neighboring farm to the wrong family line. The error was never corrected. Over time, the family had paid taxes on imaginary animals and invisible land for nearly 120 years. When the error was finally acknowledged in 1806, the clerk simply wrote, "Correction noted, no refund authorized." The bureaucracy of death. One of the strangest qualities of tax language is its resistance to finality, even death. In medieval England, if a man died owing taxes, the responsibility transferred not just to his heir, but to his land. That meant the land itself was burdened with debt, regardless of who inherited it. In some towns, a piece of property could go unsold for generations, labeled encumbered, because no one could afford to resolve the ledger balance. In 19th century France, widows frequently received tax notices addressed to their deceased husbands years after burial. A Parisian widow once replied to such a letter with one of her own. "He now pays his dues to another kingdom. I suggest your collector consult the celestial registry." Her humor was not appreciated, she was fined. Language as wall, language as gate. For those who could not read the language of tax, options were few. Some hired translators or legal scribes, whose services came at a cost. Others simply trusted that the figure quoted was correct. A few tried to learn the codes themselves. In early 20th century Romania, a woman named Ana Floria, a farmer's daughter, taught herself the notation system used by traveling assessors. She began decoding local ledgers, helping her neighbors appeal unfair tax hikes. She worked unpaid, using only a slate board and chalk. Eventually, authorities labeled her an agitator. Her name was entered into a separate ledger, not as a debtor but as person of concern. The language of power does not easily welcome interpreters. The invention of the form letter. As bureaucracies modernized, handwritten entries gave way to form letters, pre-printed pages with blank spaces for names, dates, amounts owed. These letters spoke in a voice stripped of personality, where old assessors might scribble "widow, struggling, delay collection," the form letter said. "Dear Sir or Madam, our records indicate an unpaid balance in the amount of 43.17 units. Failure to remit payment within 10 days may result in additional penalties." The shift was more than stylistic. It signaled a new philosophy. People were no longer individuals to be assessed. They were entries to be managed, columns to be balanced, forms to be filed. The old language, the intimate, flawed, sometimes cruel shorthand of scribes had been replaced by automation's neutrality. Or so it seemed. The persistence of obscurity. Today, tax documents still confuse. Despite digitization, despite user interfaces, the language remains riddled with opaque terms. Adjusted gross income, carry-forward loss, depreciation schedule, fiscal year rollover. Even when rendered in plain English, the meaning escapes many. Instructions loop back on themselves. Definitions depend on other definitions, and each update to the code introduces new terms, new exceptions, new footnotes. In this way, the old scribes still win. Their legacy is not in the ink, but in the impenetrability, a tradition of hiding judgment inside calculation, authority inside terminology. The forgotten language of tax assessors hasn't disappeared. It has simply evolved. Now it wears a different face. Now it uses PDFs instead of parchment. Archival echoes when we read the ledgers today. Archivists around the world still catalog old tax ledgers preserved for historical insight, but mostly unreadable to the casual eye. Scholars spend years decoding marginal notes, tracing changes in script and phrase. A single symbol 3 lines beneath a name can mean contested, or exempt, or deceased, depending on the region and era. In Prague, a digitization project found that many 16th century tax books contain jokes, puns, sarcastic remarks, even doodles of animals next to evasive taxpayers. One scribe drew a fox beside a landlord's name with the note, "Slips through nets, claims poor harvest every year." Even as they enforced the system, assessors left their humanity in the margins. These notes weren't meant to last, but they survived. They remind us that behind the formality of taxation was always a person watching, writing, judging, and occasionally laughing. What remains? The old language of tax assessment has mostly fallen silent. The clerks have gone, the codes have changed, the ink has dried. But the concept, the mechanism of measurement, the logic of obligation, the idea that your existence must be legible to a system remains as strong as ever. And so does the gap between those who write the rules and those who try to understand them. Whether it's a Latin ledger in 1304 or a digital tax portal in 2025, the fundamental challenge is the same. How do you interpret a language that wasn't written for you? Final reflection. As you set aside this story of assessors and scribes, you may find yourself pondering. If a system is built on language one speaks, what exactly is it trying to say? Story 5. When the lighthouse ran out of oil. The light that meant everything. Imagine the sea at night. No stars, no moon, only the sound of water, constant and cruel. Sailors half asleep at their posts, watching for something they hope never comes, rocks. And then in the distance, a glimmer, steady, rhythmic, reliable, a lighthouse. Not just a building, a promise. To the mariner it meant safety, a signal that someone somewhere had kept the flame alive. But to the man in the tower, often alone, often cold, it meant duty, oil, wick, timing. And what happened when that oil ran out? This is not the story of shipwrecks or dramatic rescues. It is the quiet history of maintenance, of supply chains, and of human fragility beneath the illusion of steady light. The lonely life of the lightkeeper. Lighthouses in the 18th and 19th centuries were not automated. They required people keepers who climbed narrow stairs, trimmed wicks, cleaned lenses, and stayed awake through storms. A lightkeeper's world was ruled by schedules and solitude. Logs were maintained with religious precision. Lamp lit at 7:03 p.m. Winds moderate. Oil supply reduced. Requisition filed. These keepers were expected to be invisible but infallible. The light must shine, always. But that depended on fuel. The supply chain of safety. Lighthouses didn't run on magic. They ran on whale oil, later kerosene, and eventually gas or electricity. In their early days, especially in isolated coastal regions, oil was delivered by boat sometimes just once per season. If the delivery failed due to storms, budget cuts, war, or forgetfulness, the consequences could be fatal. The lighthouse might keep shining for days or weeks using reserves, but once those ran out, the flame would go dark. And sailors, unaware, would continue sailing toward what they believed was a signal of safety. The incident at Point Hesperus, 1837. On the bleak northern coast of Scotland stood the Point Hesperus lighthouse, sturdy, cold, and essential. In December 1837, a storm delayed the scheduled oil delivery. The keeper, Thomas McCree, had rationed supplies carefully. He used only one burner instead of two. He cleaned the lamp daily to maximize brightness. But on the night of December 16th, the oil ran dry. He recorded in the log. Light failed at 2:46 a.m. Prayed for no ships. That same night, a schooner out of Hamburg misread the coastline. With no beacon to guide them, they crashed on rocks 2 miles north. All survived, thanks to the tide and the crew's luck, but the incident was recorded with cold precision by the shipping board. Light not observed, conditions unclear. No official blame was placed. After all, the keeper had done everything he could, but the fragility of the system had been exposed. One storm, one delay, one night, that's all it took. A system built on assumptions. Lighthouses were symbols of reliability, but the infrastructure behind them was anything but. The oil delivery systems were run by overworked bureaucrats. Funding came from shipping taxes and regional levies. In times of war or economic downturn, budgets shrank. In 1854, during the Crimean War, supply to dozens of lighthouses in the British Isles was disrupted as fuel was redirected to naval operations. Reports from the time describe keepers burning animal fat, coal tar, even fish oil to keep the lamps alive. One keeper in Wales allegedly used butter for 2 nights. The smell was terrible, the light faint, but it was all he had. The ledger before the lamp. Before a single wick was trimmed, there were requisition forms. In France, under Napoleon, lightkeepers were required to submit monthly oil usage reports. These were reviewed by commissaires who compared allocations against expected weather conditions. If a keeper used too much oil during a calm month, they were reprimanded. If they used too little, they were suspected of slacking. This meant that fear of punishment sometimes outweighed fear of darkness. In 1822, a keeper on the Atlantic coast admitted posthumously in his diary that he dimmed the light on clear nights to avoid accusations of waste. He wrote, "No ship will need me when the stars are bright. Let the stars do the work." Technological fixes and new problems. With the advent of Fresnel lenses in the 1820s, lighthouses became more efficient. A single lamp could now project farther thanks to concentric glass prisms. Less oil was needed, fewer wicks, brighter light. But these lenses required cleaning, care, and even more precise fuel control. Technology, as always, did not remove human labor, it restructured it. Later came gas lights, connected via undersea pipes to coastal stations. Then electrification, which promised an end to the dependence on oil. But every innovation introduced new dependencies. On wires, on generators, on repairmen who had to brave storms to fix frayed cables. The risk had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape. Automation and the vanishing keeper. By the mid-20th century, most lighthouses were automated. Electric bulbs replaced flames. Timers replaced human judgment. Remote monitoring took over. Lightkeepers, once essential, were dismissed in waves. Many left with a sense of pride but also grief. They had kept a lonely vigil for years, often decades. Now they were obsolete. But automation didn't always mean perfection. In 1972, the electrified beacon at Cape Ennui, a real place, despite the name, failed due to a tripped circuit breaker. The alarm system, meant to notify the mainland, had also failed. A fuse had corroded in the salt air. For 3 days, no one noticed. The ships, fortunately, stayed away due to weather. No tragedy occurred, but the post-incident report noted. In the era of automation, human eyes remain advisable. What the darkness meant. When a lighthouse went dark not by design, but by accident, it created not only danger but symbolic unease. To the maritime world, darkness suggested neglect, collapse, even abandonment. In coastal villages, children would be sent to look up at the tower at night. If the light was off, their parents grew tense. It meant something was wrong not just with the building but with the system. The absence of light wasn't just about visibility, it was about trust. As you picture the lonely tower on a storm-beaten coast, and the man inside watching oil drip down the wick, you may find yourself wondering. When a system of safety depends on people we forget, how long can it hold before it goes dark? The weight of a missed shipment. By the late 1800s, maritime traffic had doubled in most of the industrial world. Every year, thousands of ships, cargo carriers, fishing vessels, naval fleets moved through narrow channels and storm-heavy straits. And every one of them relied in some way on a steady glow from a lighthouse. Yet behind that glow was a long chain of dependencies: fuel procurement officers, lighthouse service clerks, coastal warehouse managers, boatmen, and finally the keepers themselves. At any point along this chain, something could fail. And when it did, there was rarely a backup plan. Take the case of the Cape Bohème Lighthouse, 1892. An oil delivery barge scheduled for the first of the month was delayed due to engine failure. The harbor master forgot to file a replacement request. The next scheduled shipment was 28 days away. The keeper, Louis Marchal, filed a note on the fourth day: burning emergency rations, lantern trimmed to minimum. On day 9, the light failed entirely. 3 days later, a merchant ship grounded in fog on a shoal known locally as the Blind Edge. No lives were lost, but the cargo, ink and barrels of linseed oil, was ironically meant for lighthouse districts along the coast. Form 47B, requesting the obvious. In the British lighthouse service during the early 20th century, all resupply had to be requested using Form 47B, a document that required multiple signatures, projected usage logs, weather logs, and confirmation of previous deliveries. The form itself took hours to complete and had to be filed 2 weeks in advance, a timeline that, in unpredictable coastal weather, made no practical sense. If the form was delayed, misplaced, or filled out incorrectly, the system halted. One keeper in the Orkney Islands wrote bitterly, "The form asked me to estimate next month's fog. The risk of too much efficiency." By the 1930s, many lighthouse services adopted minimum stock policies, a practice borrowed from factory inventory management. Supplies were streamlined. Deliveries were trimmed for cost. Oil, wicks, and cleaning cloths were distributed just in time. This worked on paper, but it failed in life. A fog-heavy spring in 1934 depleted stores across the Belgian coast. With fuel reserves exhausted, many lights went dark simultaneously. In Zeebrugge, 2 freighters collided in shallow water. The accident caused no fatalities, but it revealed a crucial flaw. The system had assumed average fog. Reality delivered more. The keepers log as protest. Some lightkeepers, often perceived as quiet and obedient civil servants, found subtle ways to protest the systemic neglect they faced. Their official logs became records not just of lamp maintenance, but of administrative absurdity. One entry, 1906. Lamp lit at 7:14. Burned at half rate due to stinginess of budget masters. Another, 1911. Foghorn out of operation. Sent pigeon message to district office, awaiting feathers of response. These dry remarks were not acts of defiance, they were quiet acts of preservation, ensuring someone someday might know the system didn't fail from laziness, but from mismanagement at a distance. When silence replaced the light. The idea of a lighthouse going dark was unnerving, but perhaps more disturbing was when a foghorn failed. The horn was often the only signal a mariner had in thick weather. If the horn fell silent, it wasn't always clear whether the light was out or if the building was even still staffed. In 1921, the foghorn at Point Leon failed after a lightning strike disabled its fuel pump. No one heard from the lighthouse for over 12 days. The district assumed all was well, until a passing ship radioed that the tower windows were shuttered, and no light had been seen in 2 nights. A supply boat was dispatched. Inside, they found the keeper unconscious from carbon monoxide exposure caused by a cracked stove pipe. He survived. His log read: "Horn failed, light fatting, cannot leave the lamp." His final words before collapsing had been to the flame: The lighthouse board, a machine in motion. Every major lighthouse service, British, American, French, Dutch, developed its own bureaucratic apparatus. The British Trinity House, the American Lighthouse Board, and others formed command structures that, while impressive in scale, were often sluggish in crisis. Reports could take weeks to be read. Decisions were often delayed in committee. One inspector joked in 1888, "By the time a barrel of oil is approved, it would have evaporated from the imagined heat of our deliberations." The very efficiency these boards sought often became their undoing. The desire for order over flexibility meant that individual needs, whether anomalies, emergency repairs, human fatigue, were subordinated to policy. In this way, lighthouses became not just beacons, but victims of their own symbolism, assumed to be eternal because they were expected to be. When the lights came back on, electricity brought great relief to many keepers. Power lines and later solar batteries reduced dependence on fragile supply chains. But the transition was not immediate or universal. In many places, kerosene remained the norm well into the 1950s. In remote outposts, coastal Greenland, Arctic Canada, subantarctic islands, oil remained the most reliable and the most limited resource. Some towers even maintained dual systems: electric lights by default, oil lamps as backup. Ironically, in a few cases, it was the backup system that saved lives. In 1967, a violent solar storm knocked out power to Iceland's entire eastern grid. Several lighthouses, still equipped with manual oil lamps, were relit by retired keepers called back to service. Their old notebooks were dusted off, the wicks were trimmed. The light returned. When the keeper was the system. The real reason many lighthouses didn't fail despite bureaucratic dysfunction was because the keepers didn't allow them to. They rationed oil more carefully than instructed. They fixed leaks with shoe leather. They invented wicks out of braided rope. They kept backup ledgers when official ones went moldy. They became not just servants of the system, but its substitutes. And their work was rarely recognized. A ship avoiding disaster never knows what it missed. A crew arriving safely rarely thinks of the man watching from the rocks. But that was the point. The light must shine, and the person who made it shine must be invisible. As you consider the men who climbed cold towers, logged each hour, and rationed oil when the world forgot them, perhaps ask yourself, how many systems do we trust not because they're stable, but because someone, somewhere, refuses to let them fail? The last manual keeper. In the autumn of 1998, the last full-time manual lighthouse keeper in the United Kingdom, Robert Stevenson, no relation to the famous engineer family, locked the lantern room at North Car Light for the final time. He had served for over 30 years. During that time, he logged over 11,000 nights of lamp tending, storm watching, and system checking. His daily tasks were unchanged since the 19th century: polish the lenses, refill the fuel, inspect the tower for leaks, and wind the rotating mechanism. But that final night, Stevenson did something uncharacteristic. He let the light shine slightly longer than protocol required. He noted in his log, "Burned an extra 7 minutes. There was no reason. I just couldn't bring myself to stop the beam." That act was never punished. Perhaps no one noticed, or perhaps they did and understood. Memorials in iron and glass. As automation swept across lighthouses in the late 20th century, many towers were decommissioned. Some were sold to private owners. Others became museums, coffee shops, or bed and breakfasts. A few were simply left to weather and salt. In some places, the machinery was left intact: the rotating lenses, the clockwork gears, the oil canisters frozen in place as if the keeper had just stepped away. These preserved relics tell a silent story of a world that once depended, quite literally, on a single person remembering to refill a lamp. There are plaques, yes, but rarely do they mention the nights without sleep, the hands burned by lanterns, the fingers numbed by wind while logging data in stormy darkness. The light is remembered, the keeper less so. A global refrain of light and labor. This story was not unique to Britain or France or America. In Japan, keepers maintained lanterns on tiny, storm-racked islets where typhoons could blow through with 2 hours' notice. In India, lighthouses on the Andaman Islands were supplied by boat only once a quarter. One recorded keeper fashioned replacement wicks out of bamboo fibers and linen threads when his delivery failed. In Chile, Patagonia's remote lighthouses endured cold and wind so fierce that some had chains bolted across the roofs to keep them from blowing apart. The keepers wore leather aprons and goggles, not for fire, but to see through hail and salt spray as they kept the lamp alive. All across the world, the story was the same, a system built to function only if someone was there to care. Letters to the lamp. One particularly moving archival discovery came from Norway's Nidingen Lighthouse, where a keeper in the 1920s, in G. Alsen, wrote regular letters not to his family, but to the lighthouse itself. Tonight, I fear the fog will outpace your beam, but I'll burn my last liter anyway because that's what we do. You've stood for 75 years now. I've watched you for 22 of them. If you fall silent, it won't be for lack of love. These were never sent. They were tucked into the maintenance logs, folded between oil receipts and wind records. His final entry, just days before he retired, read, "You never spoke back, but you never failed me. Let them remember that." Lessons in the light. It's easy to think of lighthouses as outdated relics of a time before GPS, sonar, and satellite weather maps, but they still stand, many of them, along our coasts, still blinking their steady rhythm, still holding space against the dark. Some are automated, some are backups, a few are still tended manually if only symbolically. But the real lesson of the lighthouse isn't about navigation. It's about infrastructure, invisibility, and responsibility. Because behind every steady system, every light that shines without fail, is someone who must choose to maintain it, even when no one sees them doing it. The oil that wasn't there. Let's return for a moment to the phrase that began this story. When the lighthouse ran out of oil. It sounds like a failure, a scandal, a dereliction of duty. But in most cases it was. It was the result of weather, or war, or a clerk forgetting to sign a form. It was the result of a system stretched too thin, running on the assumption that everything would go right. And yet, despite the odds, most nights the light stayed on. Because someone made sure it did. They scrounged, improvised, rationed, and endured. And when they failed, it wasn't because they were lazy. It was because the machine they supported never truly supported them. Echoes of the lighthouse in modern systems. Even now, in digital infrastructure and logistical planning, echoes of the lighthouse persist. The light is our internet uptime, our power grid stability, our emergency services, and automated alerts. We assume they work. We assume they are automatic. But behind them are still people unseen, often underpaid, who patch cables at 3 a.m., who reset servers after earthquakes, who review code for vulnerabilities no one ever sees. These are the modern keepers. And like their predecessors, they're only noticed when something goes dark. Final reflection. As you lie there, perhaps picturing the slow turn of a lens, the drip of oil, the hush of waves below. Consider this. When the world seems to shine with stability, it's almost always because someone is quietly keeping the light alive. Story 6. The bridge that kept moving. A bridge that wouldn't stay put. There is something comforting about a bridge. It connects 2 points. It stays in place. You step onto it expecting solid ground beneath your feet, even over water, even in wind. But what happens when a bridge moves? This is the story of bridges that floated, flexed, drifted, swayed, and the quiet ingenuity that kept them, just barely functional. It is not a tale of grand spans like the Golden Gate or the Tower Bridge. It is a humbler story, one of floating pontoons, temporary trestles, mud-bound causeways, and of the people who built them, used them, and sometimes watched helplessly as they disappeared downriver. A story where permanence was never the point, only access, survival, and improvisation. Pontoon bridges, where the river was the road. Long before steel and suspension, rivers were crossed using what floated. Pontoon bridges, temporary crossings made by lashing boats or barrels together and laying planks across them, were the standard solution in much of the pre-modern world. They were used in military campaigns, seasonal commerce, and flood-prone towns. These bridges moved by design. They rose and fell with the river. They twisted in the current. If the water surged, the bridge might drag its anchors. If the tide dropped, the planks tilted and sagged. In Baghdad, 10th century travelers wrote of a bridge that was more suggestion than structure. One scribe called it the hesitant crossing, because no two trips across it felt the same. The bridge that floated away, Vicksburg, 1863. During the American Civil War, a key pontoon bridge across the Mississippi was constructed by Union engineers to move supplies toward Vicksburg. It consisted of 53 flatboats lashed together, with wooden decking laid across them. Soldiers and wagons moved steadily for 3 days. Then a rainstorm upstream created a flash flood. By the morning of the 4th day, the bridge had moved half a mile downstream, pulled loose from its moorings. One engineer wrote in his report, "Bridge intact, location unknown." They found it later, still mostly together, stuck in a bend of the river. It had taken 24 supply wagons with it. Movement as a feature, not a flaw. It's tempting to see these bridges as flawed, unreliable relics of a pre-modern world, but their movement was often intentional. In parts of China, pontoon bridges were designed to be detached during flood season, pulled ashore and lashed to trees, then reassembled later. Some had hinged segments to allow river traffic to pass. In Korea, royal processions sometimes crossed on floating platforms built for the occasion, then dismantled afterward. In 18th century Russia, the Neva River was crossed by a seasonal bridge that was removed every winter to prevent ice damage. Locals became accustomed to the rhythm of its disappearance. Children were known to ask, "When does the bridge go to sleep?" The noise of the crossing. Crossing a moving bridge was never silent. Wood creaked, water slapped against the sides, chains strained and groaned, horses hesitated, people held their breath as planks shifted underfoot. A traveler crossing the Danube in 1792 described it this way: "Like walking upon a violin string, one must believe the song will not snap." For the engineers who maintained these bridges, the noise was more than ambience. It was a diagnostic tool. Creaking in the wrong place meant slippage. Silence could mean waterlogged floaters. Too much tilt could spell collapse. They developed a sixth sense not just for structure, but for movement. Bridges built to be rebuilt. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these early bridges was how often they were rebuilt, not because they failed, but because they were meant to. In 16th century Japan, many pedestrian bridges over rivers were temporary wooden structures, erected after each monsoon season and taken down before the next. The cost was less than building permanent stone structures, and repairs were simpler. The people who lived by these rivers knew how to live with bridges that came and went. They adjusted travel plans. They memorized fording spots. They taught their children how to read the water. Bridges were not landmarks, they were events. The bureaucracy of motion. With movement came paperwork. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, pontoon bridges had to be inspected weekly. Logs were kept noting not only repairs, but drift measurements. If the center of the bridge moved more than 1 meter from its original location, a new mooring plan had to be filed. Sometimes, the process to report the shift took longer than the time it took to correct it. One frustrated keeper wrote in his 1884 inspection, "Moved 2.3 meters, filed notice, rope already tightened. Why do we inform paper after we fix the thing?" Survival measured in hours. These bridges were, by their nature, always at risk. In many wars, Napoleonic, World War I, and countless others, pontoon bridges were built under fire, meant to last just long enough. Engineers constructed them while bullets flew, using logs, barrels, and even abandoned doors to support weight. One French report from 1916 noted, "Bridge expected to last 9 hours, survived 11, total crossings, 431 men, 12 wagons, 3 horses, 1 dog." Its destruction was pre-planned. They didn't mourn it. They celebrated that it worked at all. Why we forgot them. Today, few of these moving bridges remain. The permanence of concrete and the precision of GPS make us forget that, for most of history, the goal of a bridge wasn't eternity. It was today, right now. You needed to get across. You used what floated, and if it didn't hold tomorrow, you built it again. They were reminders that infrastructure doesn't have to be grand. It has to be good enough for a moment, for a crossing, for survival. As you picture a bridge rising and falling with the tide, planks moaning softly, a traveler hesitating at its edge, ask yourself, how often do we mistake stillness for strength when it's movement that keeps us afloat? A river does not wait. By their nature, rivers are not patient. They rise with rainfall. They carve new channels. They eat away at foundations. And yet, for most of human history, people insisted on crossing them anyway with no time, no permanence, and no margin for error. What followed were some of the most temporary, fragile, and surprisingly reliable bridges ever built. But to understand how these moving bridges worked, we must look more closely not at the structures themselves, but at the practical minds who made them work. Bridgewrights of necessity. The builders of floating or shifting bridges were rarely architects. They were engineers by need, soldiers, farmers, monks, millwrights, and riverfolk who knew the water better than paper plans. In medieval Europe, entire towns relied on bridgewright guilds, which specialized in building bridges for markets, festivals, and pilgrimages. These were often seasonal works, made of timber and rope, meant to last a few weeks or months before dismantling. They carried not only supplies but faith itself, worshippers en route to shrines, crossing bridges that were, themselves, minor miracles. And when the bridges moved, sagged, or tilted, the people adjusted. They didn't expect perfection. They expected passage. Anchors that couldn't anchor. One of the biggest challenges with floating bridges was not the water but the earth. Anchoring a bridge to a riverbank sounds simple. Drive in stakes, tie the ropes, secure the ends. But riverbanks erode, rocks shift, floods uproot carefully placed dead men, buried anchor logs. In many cases, the bridge moved because its anchors moved first. In 1871, engineers on the Mekong River in French Indochina tried to anchor a bridge by boring holes in the rocky banks and cementing in iron pins. After 3 weeks, the water scoured the rock so heavily that the entire shore collapsed. The bridge was found intact adrift 14 kilometers downstream. The new anchoring method: bamboo stakes tied to mature trees, which had deeper roots than anything man-made. Flexibility over strength. Engineers eventually learned that trying to make bridges resist movement often made them more likely to fail. Stiff bridges snapped under strain, loose bridges survived. This is why many pontoon bridges included flex joints gaps between segments filled with chain or rope, allowing the deck to bend and sway with the water's motion. Some were designed with slack on purpose, using curves in the bridge to absorb tension. In especially long bridges, like those on the Volga River during Tsarist Russia, engineers created bowed paths that allowed for vertical and horizontal movement. They didn't make the bridge unshakable. They made it forgiving. The bridge that rolled. In 1912, on the Oder River between Germany and Poland, an unusual experiment took place: a bridge with rolling pontoons. Rather than traditional floating logs or barrels, the pontoons were fashioned from modified water wheels that could rotate slightly with current shifts. This allowed the entire structure to subtly adjust its position, depending on the force of the river. It was not a success. The rollers jammed with silt. The whole bridge twisted under asymmetric pressure. By day 4, one side of the bridge was 2 feet lower than the other. It was dismantled before anyone could cross it safely. Still, the idea remains one of the stranger attempts to cooperate with water instead of resisting it. Building by the moon. Tidal rivers added a special complication. The bridge would not only move, but move predictably and rhythmically with the moon. Bridgekeepers on tidal rivers had to account for high tide lifting the entire span, low tide grounding outer pontoons, strong tidal currents straining connections. In the Thames, a 17th century floating bridge near Woolwich was operated only during slack tide, with planks laid just before the window and pulled immediately afterward. Miss the window, and the bridge became a hazard. An old sailor's rhyme recorded the timing: 6 bells to build it, 4 to take it down, or else the river keeps the crown. Bridges in war, built to break. During wartime, bridges were often designed to be destroyed as soon as used. Engineers carried explosive charges pre-installed into the bridge foundations. If overrun, the bridge would be detonated to prevent enemy use. But sometimes, the bridges were so unstable that commanders feared they'd collapse before being blown up. In World War II's Italian campaign, Allied forces built a pontoon bridge near Anzio that sagged so badly under tank weight, the soldiers nicknamed it the diving board. One crew refused to cross unless the tank's weight was reduced by removing the turret. They crossed safely just barely. The bridge was dismantled 2 hours later. Bridgekeepers, the quiet observers. In peacetime, someone always had to watch the bridge. Bridgekeepers were often posted at either end, sometimes in huts, sometimes just with a cot and ledger. Their job was not to enforce rules, but to monitor movement. If the planks shifted, they recorded it. If the water rose too high, they closed access. If a chain snapped, they filed a repair ticket, though often they just fixed it themselves. One Dutch keeper in the 1830s became known for sleeping in a hammock slung beneath the bridge itself, so he could feel when something was wrong. His explanation: a bridge tells you what it needs if you listen. Bridges that moved people and memory. Even when these bridges disappeared, people remembered them. They weren't admired for grandeur, but for dependability, or rather, for how dependable they were in impossible circumstances. They existed in the gaps between rain and flood, between war and peace, between dusk and high tide. They were never perfect, and they were never permanent. But they worked. And for centuries, they were the only reason some communities had access to each other at all. So much of what we call infrastructure depends not on stillness, but on movement accepted and managed. Next time you cross something solid and unmoving, consider what was once flexible, floating, and fatting beneath someone's watchful eye. What if reliability doesn't mean staying in place but knowing how and when to shift? When the bridge is gone. By now you know the theme. The bridge was there. Then it was. But in between it mattered. In the final part of our story, we'll examine what happened after the bridges were gone. Not just the structural aftermath, but the cultural memory of them. How moving bridges left behind traces, even when the physical wood and rope vanished into mud and water. Some were replaced. Some were forgotten. Some were absorbed into the land like old bones in soil. But all of them changed how people thought about movement, distance, and the spaces between. Vanished crossings of the Rhine. The Rhine River in Europe was once scattered with pontoon bridges, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries. Every summer, communities would build crossings to connect farms and towns during the dry season. One such bridge, near the town of Boppard, was reconstructed annually for nearly 140 years, until one spring it simply was. The reason was mundane. A new road bridge had opened upriver. The pontoon crossing became unnecessary. But the older townspeople noticed something strange. Even though the bridge was gone, people still walked down to where it used to be, especially on market days. They would pause by the water's edge, then turn and walk north, subconsciously rerouting themselves the way they once had across the planks. Local historians called it phantom infrastructure, not just physical, but spatial memory encoded into habit. The crossing that became a festival. In parts of Southeast Asia, the annual dismantling of river bridges became events in themselves. In Laos, certain bamboo bridges were rebuilt by monks each year after the Mekong's high season. The building wasn't just practical, it was ritual. Locals blessed the bamboo. They carried it in processions. Elders remembered the best ways to lash joints with river reed. Each year, the bridge would last just long enough for festival traffic, monks' processions, and trader caravans. Then the floods would take it. This cycle continued not because people lacked resources for something more permanent, but because they valued the impermanence. The bridge was not a structure, it was an act. Stories in the absence. Even when bridges were utterly erased by floods, fires, or time, their stories remained. In medieval England, the bridge that was became a common folk term. When people gave directions, they sometimes referenced bridges that no longer existed. Take the south path from where the bridge was, then turn by the old elm. These places had no marker, no ruins, yet everyone knew where they were. Archaeologists today use these phrases in oral histories to triangulate long-lost crossings. In many cases, they find remnants, iron pilings, submerged beams, the worn banks of long-vanished ferries. A bridge disappears. The idea of the bridge does not. The bridge without a name. One of the most poignant examples comes from Romania in the early 20th century. Between two villages separated by a winding river, an unrecorded floating bridge was built each spring and removed in the fall. It had no official name, no funding, it wasn't marked on maps. Each year, the oldest man in the village would declare the water low enough. A few dozen men would lash logs, place planks, and tie guide ropes to trees. For 5 months, the crossing enabled marriages, trade, festivals, and visiting elders. One year, there was no one old enough to declare it ready. The villagers waited, but no one stepped forward. That year, for the first time in memory, the bridge was not built. The absence wasn't blamed on money, weather, or politics. It was simply a pause in knowledge. The river remained passable, but something vital had gone missing. Bridges remembered by the body. There's an idea in psychology called embodied memory, the way our bodies remember motion and space, even when our conscious minds do not. The same is true for bridges. People who had crossed the same swaying pontoon for years often described a strange unease when crossing a new, permanent one in the same place. The new bridge might be sturdier, but it lacked the rhythm. One woman, interviewed near the Loire in 1974, said of the new steel bridge, It doesn't talk to you the way the old one did. When asked what she meant, she explained. The planks would creak in a pattern. You'd know if the current was fast. You'd feel it in your ankles. Bridges that move taught the body how to adjust, how to read, how to adapt. Bridges that don't move don't ask us to learn. When bridges were people. In many societies, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, the term for bridge was once the same as the term for ferryman or guide. The implication was simple. The act of crossing required a person. Floating bridges were sometimes extensions of individuals maintained, adjusted, and even guided by human hands. If the crossing changed, people would ask, who is the bridge now? In this worldview, a bridge wasn't a noun. It was a verb, something someone did, not something that simply was. When we moved toward fixed infrastructure, we lost that grammar. The legacy of flexibility. Floating and moving bridges have mostly disappeared from our daily lives. Today's crossings are built to last centuries: stone, steel, concrete, and carbon fiber. But echoes remain. In military engineering, portable Bailey bridges and modular pontoons are still deployed in emergencies. In extreme weather zones, drawbridges and tide-sensitive crossings remain essential. Even the concept of temporary infrastructure used for festivals, field hospitals, or disaster response draws directly from the mindset of build only what you need and expect it to move. These aren't outdated concepts. They are survival principles in changing conditions. Stillness is a luxury. We forget sometimes how recent permanence is. For most of human history, bridges were instruments of negotiation. You didn't control the river. You worked with it. You watched, listened, and rebuilt when necessary. That way of thinking isn't outdated, it's simply been paved over. But in a world of rising seas, melting roads, and shifting coastlines, we may yet need to remember how to build things that can move, and how to cross without fear when they do. Final reflection. So when you next cross a bridge, steel, stone, or concrete, pause for a moment. Imagine the creak of wet wood, the tug of a loose rope, the low groan of the current pushing beneath you. Not every bridge must last forever. Some only need to last long enough for you to pass. And isn't that in the end enough?